What kind of world gives rise to a ruler who becomes admired by both his allies and his enemies, remembered not only for conquest but for restraint? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what your local time is. It's always quietly remarkable to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the middle of the 12th century, the Eastern Mediterranean was a region defined by division. The First Crusade had carved out a string of Latin Christian states along the Levantine coast: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. These states were ruled by European nobles who had settled far from their original homes, surrounded by Arabic-speaking Muslim populations. Byzantine Christians, Armenians, and Jews. The landscape itself was layered with history. Cities such as Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo had been centers of learning and governance long before the arrival of the Crusaders. The Islamic world, which many in Europe imagined as unified, was anything but. Authority was divided between rival dynasties, regional warlords, and competing visions of religious legitimacy. The Abbasid Caliph still sat in Baghdad, recognized in theory as the spiritual head of Sunni Islam. Yet his political authority had weakened over generations. Real power in much of the region rested with Turkish military dynasties who ruled in his name. In Egypt, however, a different caliphate had endured for 2 centuries. The Fatimid caliphs, adherents of Shia Islam, governed from Cairo and maintained their own claim to spiritual leadership. Between these centers lay Syria, a crossroads of armies and ideas. Cities such as Aleppo and Damascus were governed by leaders who navigated a careful balance between resisting the Crusader states and competing with fellow Muslim rulers. Alliances shifted often. Rivalries were personal as much as ideological. Armies moved along trade routes that had been established long before the Crusades began. For the ordinary inhabitant of these lands, daily life continued with a certain rhythm despite the presence of fortresses and campaigns. Markets opened at dawn. Scholars debated theology in courtyards. Caravans carried spices, textiles, and manuscripts across deserts and along the Nile. Yet above this steady routine hung a constant awareness of instability. A change of ruler could alter taxes. A failed harvest could weaken a city's defenses. News of a Crusader raid or a rival emir's advance could transform the political landscape within weeks. In northern Syria, the city of Aleppo stood as one of the principal centers of resistance to the Crusader states. Its rulers recognized that fragmented authority invited defeat. Among them was Ahmad Zeni, a Turkish Atabeg who began consolidating territory in the 1140s. He captured Edessa, the first Crusader state to fall, and in doing so reshaped the balance of power. After his death, his son Nur-ad-Din inherited not only territory but a broader vision that Muslim lands must be unified to withstand foreign occupation. Nur-ad-Din governed from Damascus and Aleppo with a reputation for discipline and religious commitment. He patronized scholars, built hospitals, and emphasized the idea of jihad as a unifying principle, not merely as warfare, but as collective effort toward moral and political reform. Under his rule, the language of unity became increasingly prominent. Yet, unity was not easily achieved. Each region had its own elites, its own traditions, and its own interests. Meanwhile, Egypt faced its own instability. The Fatimid Caliphate, once formidable, had grown internally weak. Court factions competed for influence. Viziers rose and fell rapidly. The Nile, whose annual flooding determined agricultural success, remained the foundation of Egypt's wealth. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled immense resources. Its ports connected to the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Its treasury could sustain large armies. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem understood Egypt's importance. So did Nur-ad-Din. Control of Egypt could tip the balance of the entire region. Campaigns toward the Nile became more frequent in the 1160s as Syrian forces and Crusader armies both sought influence there. Egypt became not just a neighboring territory but the hinge upon which the future of the Levant would turn. In this atmosphere of division and ambition, political authority was rarely inherited peacefully. Military commanders advanced through loyalty, competence, and careful alliances. Dynasties rose quickly and could disappear just as quickly. The concept of a caliph still carried spiritual weight, yet practical governance depended on armies and administrators. It was into this complex environment that a young Kurdish boy would come of age. He was born not into obscurity but into a family connected to the military class. His relatives served regional rulers. They were neither impoverished nor royal. They belonged to that mobile stratum of officers who moved from court to court offering service where opportunity allowed. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. In time he would become known by an honorific Saladin, meaning righteousness of the faith. In Europe, he would be remembered as Saladin. At the time of his birth in 1137 or 1138, few could have predicted his eventual role. He was not the eldest son of a reigning monarch. He did not inherit a throne. His path would be shaped by circumstance, mentorship, and a gradual accumulation of authority within a world that demanded both patience and decisiveness. The era he entered was defined by fragmentation, yet it also contained the possibility of consolidation. Religious identity mattered deeply, but so did political pragmatism. Leaders negotiated across faith lines when necessary. Trade persisted even during warfare. Diplomacy accompanied conflict as often as it followed it. By the mid-12th century, the question facing the region was no longer simply whether the Crusader states would endure, but whether the Muslim world could organize itself effectively enough to confront them in a sustained manner. Military victories alone were insufficient. Administrative stability, economic resources, and shared legitimacy were essential. Within a few decades, these elements would converge under one figure. But at the moment our story begins, that convergence was still only a possibility. The stage had been set by earlier generations, by Zeni's campaigns, by Nur ad-Din's reforms, by the weakening of the Fatimid Caliphate, and by the enduring presence of Latin Christian rulers in Jerusalem and along the coast. The Mediterranean remained a corridor of exchange and contest. Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem each represented different claims to authority and holiness. In this divided landscape, the emergence of a unifying ruler would depend not only on military skill, but on navigating competing loyalties and restoring confidence among diverse populations. It would require a careful balance between ambition and restraint. For now, the young Yusuf Nob was growing up in the shadow of larger forces, absorbing the culture of courts and camps, learning the habits of command, and observing how quickly fortunes could change in a world where legitimacy was constantly negotiated. In 1137 or 1138, in the city of Tikrit along the Tigris River, Yusuf ibn was born into a Kurdish family already accustomed to movement. Tree stood between Baghdad and Mosul, a fortified town that watched the river traffic and guarded regional routes. It was not a capital, yet it held strategic importance. Control of such towns often shifted between powerful governors, and careers were shaped by loyalty to the right patron at the right moment. Yusuf's father, Obon Shadi, served as a military officer under the Seljuk ruler of Mosul. His uncle Sheru was also a commander. The family belonged to the Kurdish ethnic group, long integrated into the military structures of the Seljuk and other Turkish-led dynasties. Kurdish officers were valued for their experience in frontier warfare and their familiarity with the mountainous regions between Mesopotamia and Syria. They were not outsiders, but neither were they at the very top of the hierarchy. Advancement depended on performance and trust. Soon after Yusuf's birth, political tension forced the family to leave Tikrit. A conflict involving their patron led to a change in control, and Ayyub and Shiru relocated to Mosul. From there they entered the service of Imad ad-Din Zeni, the powerful Atabeg who sought to consolidate Muslim territories against the Crusader states. This early relocation shaped Yusuf's childhood. Stability was never assumed. Allegiance was practical. Security required adaptation. Growing up in Mosul and later in Baalbek and Damascus, Yusuf would have received the education expected of a young man from a military household. He studied the Quran, learned Arabic literature, and became familiar with Islamic jurisprudence. Education in this period was not limited to religious instruction. Arithmetic, poetry, and history formed part of elite training. The courts of Syria valued learning, and scholars traveled between cities under patronage. There is little evidence that Yusuf displayed extraordinary ambition in youth. Contemporary chroniclers do not describe him as a prodigy. Instead, they suggest a reserved temperament. He showed interest in religious study and reportedly preferred scholarly discussion to battlefield training in his early years. This detail preserved in later accounts fits the broader cultural environment of Nuruddin, Syria, where rulers promoted piety and the construction of madras alongside Military campaigns. Damascus, where Yusuf spent much of his adolescence, was one of the most significant cities in the region. Its markets connected inland trade to Mediterranean ports. Its orchards and irrigation systems supported a substantial population. Politically, it was a prize contested by rival dynasties until Nuruddin secured control. Under his governance, Damascus became a center of Sunni revival. Institutions were built to reinforce Sunni orthodoxy in response to both Crusader presence and Shia influence from Egypt. It was in this setting that Yusuf's understanding of religious legitimacy developed. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, though politically weakened, remained the symbolic head of Sunni Islam. Recognition from Baghdad mattered. Coins were minted in the caliph's name. Friday sermons invoked his authority. These gestures signaled inclusion within a shared religious framework. At the same time, political reality demanded negotiation with non-Sunni powers. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo upheld Shia doctrine and maintained its own network of loyalty. The Crusader states, though Christian, entered into truces and trade agreements when convenient. Yusuf grew up observing this layered landscape. Faith shaped identity, yet governance required flexibility. His family's relationship with Nur Adan proved decisive. After Zeni's death, Nur Adan continued his father's campaign of consolidation. All Banshiru remained loyal. Their loyalty was rewarded with appointments and land grants. Through them, Yusuf entered the administrative and military circles of Syria. Advancement came gradually through service rather than inheritance. Shika in particular would influence Yusuf's early career. Known for his forceful personality and battlefield experience, Shirk became one of Nuruddin's leading generals. When events in Egypt demanded intervention, it was Sharu who was chosen to lead expeditions. Yusuf accompanied him not as a commander, but as part of his retinue. His initial role was subordinate. He observed more than he directed. Egypt in the 1160s was unstable. The Fatimid Caliph Saladin was young and politically weak. Powerful viewers competed for control. One faction invited Nur ad-Din's assistance to counter internal rivals and the threat of Crusader intervention. The Crusader king Amalek I of Jerusalem also sought influence in Egypt, recognizing its wealth and strategic importance. The Nile Delta became a field of competing ambitions. When Shiru marched into Egypt in 1164, Yusuf traveled with him. The campaign involved maneuvering between local factions and confronting Crusader forces. Control of Cairo shifted rapidly. Yusuf's presence in these campaigns exposed him to complex political negotiation. Armies did not simply conquer. They bargained, installed allies, and secured financial concessions. Shakuz's campaigns were not immediately decisive. Control of Egypt changed hands multiple times over several years. Yet each expedition increased Syrian influence. For Yusuf, this period marked a transition from observer to participant. Though not yet the central figure, he gained practical experience in administration and logistics. Egypt's bureaucracy, inherited from centuries of Fatimid governance, was sophisticated. Tax collection along the Nile required coordination. Grain distribution and urban management demanded oversight. In 1169, Shaku was appointed vizier of Egypt. His tenure was brief. He died only months later, likely from illness. The position of vizier, effectively the chief minister, held immense power. The Fatimid Caliph remained as a symbolic ruler, but the vizier controlled military and financial affairs. After Shiku's death, Yusuf was chosen to succeed him. The decision surprised some contemporaries. Yusuf was in his early 30s and had not yet commanded independently on a large scale. However, he was trusted by Nuruddin and acceptable to Egyptian elites. His temperament may have reassured those wary of domination by Assyrian military strongman. As vizier, he adopted the honorific Saladin. This appointment marked the beginning of a transformation. Yusuf, who had once shown preference for scholarly study, now governed one of the richest provinces in the Islamic world. He faced immediate challenges: stabilizing finances, managing Fatimid court factions, and preparing for potential Crusader invasion. The cultural environment of Egypt differed from Syria. Cairo, founded by the Fatimids, was a center of Shia learning and administration. Al-Azhar Mosque functioned as a hub of scholarship aligned with Fatimid doctrine. To govern effectively, Salah ad-Din had to navigate religious difference without provoking revolt. Abrupt change would have destabilized the city. He began cautiously. Sunni institutions were introduced gradually. Appointments shifted toward his loyal supporters. At the same time, he maintained public order and ensured the continuity of essential services. The Nile flood cycle remained the foundation of Egypt's prosperity. Agricultural stability meant political stability. During these early years in Cairo, Salah ad-Din also reinforced ties with Nur ad-Din. Officially, he remained subordinate to his Syrian patron. Egypt was governed in Nur ad-Din's name. The broader objective of unifying Muslim lands against the Crusader states persisted. Yet, the balance of power was evolving. Control of Egypt provided Salah ad-Din with independent resources. As vizier, he also faced the question of the Fatimid Caliphate itself. The Shia Caliph Aladid still reigned, though his authority was limited. The existence of two rival caliphates, Abbasid in Baghdad and Fatimid in Cairo, symbolized the fragmentation of the Islamic world. Resolving this division would alter the political landscape. By the early 1170s, the Fatimid state had grown increasingly fragile. Court factions weakened it further. Salah ad-Din, supported by Sunni jurists and his Syrian allies, prepared for a transition when Aladid fell. Albeit in 1171, the moment arrived. Upon the caliph's death, Salah ad-Din ended the Fatimid Caliphate and restored formal allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. The change was executed with limited public upheaval. Friday sermons in Cairo began to mention the Abbasid caliph's name. Coins reflected the new order. Egypt, after 2 centuries of Shia rule, returned to Sunni alignment. This act reshaped the balance of religious legitimacy in the region. For Salah ad-Din, the abolition of the Fatimid Caliphate did not mean declaring himself caliph. Instead, he positioned himself as a loyal servant of the Abbasid Caliph while consolidating effective power. His authority rested on military strength and administrative competence rather than theological claim. The boy born in Tauri had become ruler of Egypt. His ascent had been gradual, shaped by family loyalty, mentorship, and opportunity. Yet his position remained connected to Nur ad-Din's broader vision. Syria and Egypt, though linked, were not yet fully unified under his sole command. The next stage of his life would depend on events beyond Cairo. Nur ad-Din still ruled in Damascus. As long as his patron lived, Salah ad-Din's authority remained formally secondary. The future of the region would hinge on what followed. Nur ad-Din ruled from Damascus with a clear sense of purpose. His objective was not simply territorial expansion but consolidation under Sunni leadership. From his perspective, Egypt was a crucial extension of that effort. Long as Salah ad-Din governed Cairo in his name, the arrangement served both men. Yet beneath the formal hierarchy, resources and authority were beginning to shift. Nur ad-Din had spent decades strengthening Syria. He repaired fortifications, expanded mosques, and founded schools devoted to Sunni jurisprudence. His court attracted jurists, theologians, and administrators who reinforced the idea that political unity was a religious obligation. Campaigns against the Crusader states were framed within this broader moral vision. However, sustaining these campaigns required revenue, and Syria alone could not provide the wealth that Egypt's Nile agriculture generated. Salah ad-Din's position in Cairo gradually became more secure. He reorganized the Egyptian army, reducing reliance on Fatimid-era regiments and integrating forces loyal to his own family. Kurdish and Turkish soldiers who had followed him from Syria were settled and paid from Egyptian revenues. Administrative posts were filled with men whose loyalty rested with him personally, rather than with the former Fatimid court. Despite these measures, Salah ad-Din did not immediately break from Nur ad-Din's authority. Official correspondence acknowledged his Syrian patron. In public documents, he maintained the appearance of subordination. This careful balance allowed him time to solidify control without provoking open conflict. The political climate between Damascus and Cairo remained cautious. Nur ad-Din observed developments in Egypt closely. He expected that Egypt's wealth would strengthen his larger campaign against the Crusader states. At moments, tensions surfaced over how resources were allocated. Salah ad-Din moved deliberately, aware that premature assertion of independence could invite military intervention from Syria. During this period, Crusader forces continued to test Egypt's defenses. King Amalek of Jerusalem sought to exploit uncertainty. Raids and diplomatic negotiations alternated. Salah ad-Din responded by strengthening coastal fortifications and organizing naval defenses along the Mediterranean and Red Sea routes. Control of the Red Sea was particularly important for protecting trade and pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina. In 1174, the political balance shifted abruptly. Nur ad-Din died unexpectedly, leaving behind a young son. His death removed the central authority that had held much of Syria together. Regional governors, former commanders, and local elites each weighed their options. Some pledged loyalty to the child ruler. Others considered independent action. For Salah ad-Din, this moment required careful calculation. He had governed Egypt for several years, built a loyal military base, and secured substantial financial resources. Yet Syria remained symbolically central. Damascus was not merely a city. It was the heart of Nur ad-Din's project. If Syria fragmented, the broader goal of unity would dissolve. Rather than declaring himself ruler immediately, Salah ad-Din moved north under the justification of protecting Nur ad-Din's heir and preserving order. His forces entered Damascus in 1174 with limited resistance. Many in the city preferred stable governance to the uncertainty of factional struggle by positioning himself as guardian of continuity rather than usurper. He gained acceptance. Aleppo, however, did not submit as easily. It had long served as a power center independent from Damascus. Local leaders resisted external control. Over the following years, Salah ad-Din combined negotiation, military pressure, and strategic marriages to extend his authority. His approach was rarely reckless. He preferred gradual consolidation over immediate confrontation. During these campaigns, he avoided presenting himself as rival to the Abbasid Caliph. Instead, he reinforced his Sunni credentials. Sermons invoked the Caliph's name. Patronage supported scholars aligned with Orthodox Jewish prudence. By aligning religious legitimacy with political expansion, he strengthened his position without claiming spiritual supremacy. The consolidation of Syria required more than battlefield success. Urban elites, merchants, and religious authorities had to be reassured that their privileges would be maintained. Salah ad-Din confirmed existing land grants, reduced certain taxes, and cultivated relationships with influential families. Stability encouraged cooperation. Meanwhile, Egypt remained the financial backbone of his expanding domain. The Nile's predictable flooding provided grain surplus that could supply armies. Trade through Alexandria and other ports generated revenue from Mediterranean commerce. By linking Syrian military manpower with Egyptian wealth, Salah ad-Din created a durable foundation. In 1176, he achieved formal recognition from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. This acknowledgement strengthened his legitimacy. It confirmed him not as Caliph but as Sultan, a ruler exercising authority on behalf of the Caliph. The title reflected practical power, without challenging established religious hierarchy. The title of Sultan was significant. It signaled that military and administrative leadership could exist alongside the caliphate without merging into it. In practice, the Abbasid Caliph's political reach was limited, yet his symbolic authority unified Sunni lands. Salah ad-Din's acceptance of this arrangement demonstrated his preference for stability over doctrinal innovation. Over the next several years, he continued consolidating control over key Syrian cities including Homs, Hama, and eventually Aleppo in 1183. Each acquisition strengthened the network of fortifications stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. Communication routes improved. Garrisons were reorganized. The political map began to reflect a more coherent structure. Throughout this expansion, the Crusader states observed carefully. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had long benefited from Muslim disunity. Internal rivalries among Syrian and Egyptian rulers had prevented coordinated resistance. As Salah ad-Din unified territories, the strategic balance shifted. A single authority now commanded resources across two major regions. Despite the scale of his achievements, his governance style remained methodical. He did not impose sweeping cultural changes on conquered cities. Instead, he preserved local administrative systems while inserting trusted officials at key points. This approach reduced resistance and maintained economic continuity. Salah ad-Din also invested in public works in Cairo. He began constructing a citadel to strengthen defenses and symbolize stability in Damascus and other cities. He supported madrasa construction and religious endowments. These projects reinforced Sunni identity while demonstrating responsible stewardship. His personal habits during this period were noted by chroniclers. He was described as disciplined, attentive to religious observance and modest in lifestyle compared to some contemporaries. Whether fully accurate or partially shaped by later admiration, these accounts contributed to his reputation as a ruler guided by moral restraint rather than excess. By the early 1180s, the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean had changed markedly from the fragmented world of his youth. Egypt and Syria were unified under his leadership. The Fatimid Caliphate had ended. Abbasid spiritual authority had been reaffirmed. The Crusader states now faced a coordinated power, yet consolidation alone did not resolve. Tensions, border disputes persisted. Truces were negotiated and broken. Certain Crusader leaders, particularly Riald of Chashan, pursued aggressive raids that targeted Muslim caravans and pilgrimage routes. These actions heightened hostility and tested the fragile balance. Salah ad-Din's strategy combined patience with preparation. He strengthened alliances among regional emirs, ensured logistical readiness, and waited for circumstances that would justify a larger mobilization. His authority was now established enough to coordinate a sustained campaign. The boy, who had once traveled behind his uncle's command, now directed a multi-realm state. His rise had not followed a dramatic leap, but a series of measured steps. Service under Nur ad-Din, governance in Egypt, careful assumption of Syrian leadership, and steady reinforcement of legitimacy. By the mid-18s, the conditions for a decisive confrontation were forming. The question was no longer whether unity could be achieved. It had been. The question was how that unity would reshape the balance with the Crusader kingdoms that had endured for nearly a century. Before the confrontation that would later define his reputation, Salah ad-Din devoted sustained attention to strengthening the structure of his rule. Military unity alone was not sufficient. The territories under his authority stretched across diverse landscapes, river valleys, desert routes, fortified hill towns, and coastal ports. Each region required careful oversight. Administration, finance, and internal cohesion became central concerns. Egypt remained the economic core. The Nile's annual flood determined agricultural productivity and with it state revenue. Salah ad-Din preserved the existing taxation framework but reduced certain extraordinary levies that had burdened urban populations under late Fatimid rule. By maintaining predictability in taxation, he reassured merchants and landowners that governance would remain stable. Grain surpluses from the Nile Valley were stored and redistributed to supply garrisons and cities during shortages. In Cairo, construction continued on the citadel overlooking the city. Its walls symbolized security and permanence. The choice to invest in fortifications rather than palace extravagance reflected priorities shaped by decades of regional instability. The citadel also allowed centralized control over military forces stationed in Egypt, reducing the risk of factional revolt within the capital. In Syria, the administrative pattern differed. Cities such as Damascus and Aleppo possessed long-established elites and institutions. Salah ad-Din avoided abrupt replacement of local officials. Instead, he confirmed existing judges and governors who pledged loyalty. Endowments for religious schools increased. Sunni jurists were encouraged to expand their influence, reinforcing doctrinal unity with Baghdad. His family played a significant role in governance. Brothers, sons, and nephews were appointed to oversee key provinces. This distribution of authority created a network of loyalty that strengthened the Ayyubid house. At the same time, it introduced potential rivalry among relatives. For the moment, cohesion held largely because Saladin's authority was undisputed. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad remained a symbolic partner in legitimacy. Diplomatic exchanges reinforced mutual recognition. Friday sermons throughout the territories mentioned the Caliph's name, affirming Sunni alignment. In return, Salah ad-Din received confirmation of his title and acknowledgement as protector of the holy cities. Trade continued to flow despite persistent tension with the Crusader states. Mediterranean ports such as Alexandria and Acre facilitated exchange of goods between Muslim and Christian merchants. Commercial agreements often survived even when military hostilities resumed. This interdependence complicated relations. War disrupted trade, yet trade generated wealth for both sides. Within the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, internal divisions weakened political coherence. Succession disputes and disagreements among nobles affected strategic decisions. King Baldwin IV, afflicted with illness, ruled during part of this period. His condition created uncertainty regarding future leadership. After his death, factional rivalry intensified. Riald of Chashan, Lord of Altry Jordan, adopted an aggressive posture toward Muslim caravans. He attacked trade routes and threatened pilgrimage traffic, bound for Mecca. These actions violated existing truces. Salah ad-Din responded with diplomatic protest, initially seeking to avoid premature escalation. However, repeated raids eroded the possibility of sustained peace. By the mid-18s, Saladin had completed most of his territorial consolidation. Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula acknowledged his authority. He commanded a larger, more unified force than any Muslim ruler since the early decades of the Crusades. Yet he did not rush into open war. Mobilization required coordination across vast distances. Troops from Egypt had to cross the Sinai and move into Syria. Supplies needed to be stockpiled. Horses, provisions, and siege equipment were prepared gradually. His leadership style favored readiness over sudden reaction. In 1187, events converged. Real's renewed attacks and the breakdown of truces provided the pretext for full mobilization. Saladin called upon emirs across his territories to assemble. Forces gathered from Damascus, Aleppo, Egypt, and beyond. The scale of this mobilization reflected years of preparation. The Crusader kingdom, aware of the threat, mustered its own forces. The resulting campaign would center near the Sea of Galilee. Saladin's strategy emphasized control of water sources and terrain. Summer heat intensified the challenge for both armies. Coordination across a unified command structure gave his forces an advantage in logistics. The Battle of Hattin in July 1187 proved decisive. Crusader forces attempting to relieve the besieged city of Tiberias marched across arid terrain. Saladin's troops harassed their advance, cutting access to water. Exhaustion and heat weakened the Crusader army before direct engagement began. When confrontation occurred near the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin, the Crusader army was encircled. Many knights were captured. Others were killed. The true cross, a relic carried into battle by the Crusaders, fell into Muslim hands. The defeat dismantled much of the kingdom's military capacity in a single campaign. Saladin treated captured nobles according to rank and circumstance. King Guy of Jerusalem was taken prisoner. Rield of Chashan, held responsible for repeated violations of truces, was executed. Other captives were ransomed. The outcome demonstrated both firmness and calculation. Eliminating a persistent aggressor while sparing others reinforced his authority without provoking indiscriminate retaliation. The strategic consequences of Hattin were immediate. With the Crusader field army shattered, fortified cities across the Levant stood vulnerable. Saladin moved swiftly but methodically, capturing Akkor, Nablus, Jaffa, and other towns in succession. Resistance varied. Some cities negotiated surrender to avoid destruction. Jerusalem remained the symbolic objective. The city held profound significance for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. It had been under Crusader control since 1099. By September 1187, Saladin's forces approached its walls. Unlike the massacre that followed the Crusader capture nearly a century earlier, negotiations preceded the city's surrender. Terms were arranged allowing inhabitants to ransom themselves. Many were permitted safe passage. Christian holy sites were respected. Jewish communities were allowed to return after decades of exclusion. Administrative control shifted, but urban life continued. The transition was structured rather than chaotic. The recapture of Jerusalem resonated across the Mediterranean world. In Europe, news of the city's fall prompted calls for a new crusade. In the Islamic world, it affirmed the success of long-term unification. Saladin's reputation expanded beyond regional boundaries, yet governance of reclaimed territory required attention. Maintaining order in newly acquired cities demanded garrisons, legal administration, and tax regulation. Pilgrimage routes were reorganized. Religious endowments were restored to Muslim institutions. Christian communities continued to reside in many towns under negotiated terms. The campaign of 1187 did not eliminate the Crusader presence entirely. Coastal strongholds such as Tai remained outside his control. European powers prepared to intervene. The balance of power had shifted, but conflict was not concluded. Saladin's rise from Kurdish officer's son to Sultan of a unified realm had unfolded over decades of careful maneuvering. His success rested not only on battlefield skill but on administrative continuity and political patience. The capture of Jerusalem marked a turning point. Yet it also introduced new challenges. European monarchs now organized what would become the Third Crusade. Forces from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire prepared to sail east. Among them would be Richard I of England, later known as Richard the Lionheart. The confrontation between these leaders would test the durability of Saladin's achievements. The unity he had constructed would soon face sustained external pressure. Whether it would endure depended not only on military outcomes, but on the cohesion of the system he had built. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 reshaped the political imagination of two continents. For the Muslim territories under Salah ad-Din's authority, the event represented the restoration of a city whose sanctity had long resonated in religious memory. For Latin Christendom, it signaled a profound loss that demanded response. Messages traveled rapidly across the Mediterranean. Sermons in European churches called for renewed mobilization. Kings who had previously been engaged in their own rivalries now faced pressure to redirect attention eastward. Within months, preparations for what became known as the Third Crusade were underway. Emperor Frederick I Barbaro of the Holy Roman Empire began assembling forces in Central Europe. King Philip II of France and King Richard I of England prepared naval expeditions. The scale of the coming response differed from earlier crusading efforts. This time reigning monarchs would personally lead armies. Salah ad-Din understood that the capture of Jerusalem did not end conflict, it intensified it. He did not dismantle his military after 1187. Instead, he redistributed forces across key strongholds. Coastal cities required reinforcement, particularly Acre and Ascalon. Supply lines between Egypt and Syria were secured. Fortifications were repaired and expanded where necessary. The Crusader presence had not vanished entirely. The city of Tyre, defended by Conrad of Montat, resisted siege. Its harbor allowed continued connection with European fleets. Salah ad-Din attempted to capture it in late 1187 and early 1088, but withdrew after sustained resistance. Tyre became a focal point for regrouping Crusader forces arriving from Europe. In 1189, Crusader armies began the long siege of Acre. The city located on the coast north of Jerusalem had recently fallen to Salah ad-Din. Its strategic importance lay in its harbor, which could receive reinforcements and supplies by sea. As European contingents arrived, Acre became the center of a protracted campaign. Salah ad-Din moved to counter the siege, establishing encampments around the Crusader lines in an effort to contain them. For nearly 2 years, the area around Acre witnessed continuous skirmishes, assaults, and counter-assaults. The siege evolved into a complex stalemate. Both sides suffered from disease and supply shortages. Seasonal weather conditions complicated operations. Frederick Barbarossa did not reach the battlefield. He drowned in 1190 while crossing a river in Anatolia, and much of his army dispersed. However, Philip II and Richard I continued forward. Richard arrived in the eastern Mediterranean in 1191 after securing Cyprus as a logistical base. His arrival altered the balance at Acre. Richard's military skill and discipline strengthened the Crusader siege operations. Coordinated assaults, supported by naval bombardment, gradually weakened the city's defenses. In July 1191, Acre surrendered. The loss represented a significant setback for Salah ad-Din. The Crusaders now possessed a strong coastal foothold from which further campaigns could proceed. Following Acre's fall, tensions arose between Richard and Philip II. Philip soon returned to France, leaving Richard as the primary Crusader commander. Richard reorganized his forces and began advancing south along the coast toward Jaffa, aiming to secure a continuous line of ports. Salah ad-Din adopted a strategy of harassment rather than direct confrontation in the open field. He sought to limit Crusader access to water and supplies while avoiding unnecessary losses. The Battle of Ars in September 1191 marked one of the major engagements of the campaign. Richard's disciplined infantry and cavalry formations repelled repeated attacks and secured a tactical victory. Despite this setback, Salah ad-Din preserved the core of his army. He recognized that time and distance favored defensive persistence. The Crusaders were operating far from home, reliant on maritime supply. Sustained campaigning in unfamiliar terrain imposed strain. Rather than risk decisive defeat, Salah ad-Din focused on preserving manpower. Over the following months, both leaders maneuvered cautiously. Richard considered advancing inland toward Jerusalem, but hesitated. Capturing the city would be difficult to sustain without secure supply lines. Salah ad-Din strengthened fortifications and maintained readiness. Diplomatic exchanges accompanied military movement. Negotiations between the two leaders reflected pragmatism. Neither side could achieve complete domination without unacceptable cost. Proposals included territorial division and guarantees for pilgrimage access. Although personal meetings did not occur, envoys carried messages between camps. Mutual respect developed, grounded in recognition of each other's discipline and authority. In 1192, Richard advanced toward Jerusalem, but ultimately withdrew, concluding that holding the city would be impractical. Instead, he negotiated a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa, agreed in September 1192, established a 3-year ceasefire. Coastal territories from Tai to Jaffa remained under Crusader control. Jerusalem stayed under Muslim governance, but Christian pilgrims were granted safe access to holy sites. The treaty did not represent complete resolution, yet it stabilized conditions temporarily. For Saladin, the agreement preserved control over Jerusalem and interior territories while acknowledging limited Crusader presence along the coast. For Richard, it secured pilgrimage rights and maintained a foothold without overextending resources. The years of continuous campaigning had strained Saladin's health. He had spent extended periods in the field coordinating forces across multiple fronts. After the treaty, he returned to Damascus. Administrative oversight resumed priority. Revenues needed recalculation after wartime expenditure. Garrisons required rotation and replenishment. His leadership style during these final years remained consistent. He emphasized consultation with jurists and commanders. Religious endowments were maintained. Urban infrastructure damage during campaigns was repaired where possible. The objective shifted from expansion to consolidation. Observers noted his modest personal finances despite vast territorial authority. Much of his wealth had been distributed in charity or expended on military logistics. At his death, chroniclers reported that little remained in his treasury. Whether entirely accurate or partially shaped by later admiration, this detail reinforced his reputation for restrained governance. In early 1193, illness confined him in Damascus. He died in March of that year at approximately 55 years of age. His death did not produce immediate fragmentation, but the structure he had built relied heavily on personal authority. Territories were divided among his sons and relatives according to established arrangements. The Ayyubid dynasty continued, yet internal rivalry would gradually weaken cohesion. Saladin's lifetime had transformed the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. He had ended the Fatimid Caliphate, unified Egypt and Syria, recaptured Jerusalem, and resisted a major European crusade. His authority operated within the framework of the Abbasid Caliphate, reinforcing Sunni orthodoxy without claiming spiritual supremacy. In both Islamic and European narratives, his image evolved. Muslim chroniclers emphasized piety, justice, and defense of sacred land. European writers, even those who opposed him, often described him as disciplined and honorable. Over time, legend and history intertwined, but the administrative and military achievements of his career remained central. The caliphate world he inhabited did not return to fragmentation immediately, yet it faced new pressures in the decades that followed. Mongol expansion, internal disputes, and shifting trade routes would alter the balance again. Saladin's achievement lay in demonstrating that unity, though difficult, was attainable within the political structures of his era. His life moved from service under established authority to independent leadership shaped by religious legitimacy and pragmatic governance. He did not claim the title of caliph, yet he operated within that world, reinforcing its symbolic framework, while exercising practical control. The Mediterranean frontier remained contested after his death, yet the memory of his rule persisted as an example of disciplined consolidation during a period defined by division. Saladin's death in 1193 did not bring immediate collapse, yet it revealed the delicate balance that had held his territories together. During his lifetime, authority had flowed through a single coordinating figure. After his passing in Damascus, that authority dispersed among heirs who inherited regions rather than a unified command. His eldest son, Alafal, received Damascus. Another son, Alziz, governed Egypt. A third, Az-Zahir, ruled Aleppo. Brothers and nephews retained control over additional cities and frontier zones. The arrangement reflected a common practice among medieval dynasties, distributing lands among family members to preserve loyalty while preventing rivalry with external claimants. In practice, however, division often invited internal competition. The Ayyubid dynasty, named after Saladin's father, Ayyubid, now functioned as a network rather than a centralized state. Each branch managed its own revenues, garrisons, and diplomatic relations. Cooperation persisted in theory, Yet local priorities diverged. Egypt, with its stable agricultural base, possessed resources that could influence Syrian politics. Damascus and Aleppo remained strategic hubs near Crusader territories. Despite these divisions, the structure Salah ad-Din had built did not disintegrate immediately. The administrative systems he had strengthened continued to operate. Sunni institutions remained dominant in Egypt. Abbasid recognition of Ayyubid authority endured. The framework of legitimacy survived even as coordination weakened. In the broader caliphate world, Baghdad still housed the Abbasid caliph. The caliph's political power was limited, yet symbolic authority mattered deeply. Ayyubid rulers continued to acknowledge the caliph in sermons and coinage. This practice reinforced continuity across Sunni territories from Egypt to Mesopotamia. The Crusader states, though diminished after 1187, maintained coastal strongholds. The truce established by the Treaty of Jaffa expired after several years and smaller conflicts resumed intermittently. However, no immediate crusade on the scale of the Third Crusade followed. European monarchs faced their own political challenges at home. Richard I died in 1199. Philip II consolidated power in France. The urgency that had mobilized Europe after Jerusalem's fall gradually subsided. Within Ayyubid territories, internal rivalry became the greater concern. Alfdal struggled to maintain authority in Damascus. His administrative inexperience contrasted with the expectations set by his father. Al-Aziz in Egypt possessed greater financial resources and challenged his brother's position. Their uncle Al-Adil, Salah ad-Din's brother, emerged as a stabilizing figure. Through negotiation and measured intervention, Al-Adil gradually consolidated control. By 1200, Al-Adil had assumed effective leadership of much of the Ayyubid realm. He restored a degree of unity, though not at the scale achieved by Salah ad-Din. The dynasty endured for several decades, balancing cooperation and competition among its branches. The caliphate system itself continued to evolve. The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad maintained ceremonial authority while regional sultans exercised practical control. This arrangement allowed for flexibility across vast territories. It also reflected a broader pattern in medieval Islamic governance where spiritual legitimacy and political power were distinct yet interconnected. During the decades following Saladin's death, intellectual and cultural life flourished in many Ayyubid cities. Madras expanded. Legal scholarship developed further. Cairo and Damascus remained centers of learning. The re-establishment of Sunni orthodoxy in Egypt became fully institutionalized. Al-Azhar, once associated with Fatimid Shia doctrine, gradually integrated into the Sunni scholarly network. Trade routes linking the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea remained active. Merchants from Italian city-states continued to engage in commerce with Muslim ports. Even in periods of military tension, economic exchange persisted. This interdependence reflected the pragmatic realities of the region. The memory of Salah ad-Din began to shape political culture. Chronicles written by contemporaries and near contemporaries emphasized his justice, restraint, and commitment to religious duty. These narratives served both as historical record and as guidance for future rulers. His conduct at Jerusalem, particularly the decision to allow ransoms and protect Christian holy sites, became a recurring point of reference. European writers also incorporated his figure into their histories. Although adversary in war, he was often described with respect. Over time, stories embellished his character, presenting him as a model of chivalry. These portrayals reflected cross-cultural perceptions shaped by the prolonged contact of crusading and counter-crusading societies. The political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean continued to change. In the early 13th century, new crusades targeted different objectives, including the Fourth Crusade, which diverted toward Constantinople rather than the Levant. Meanwhile, the Ayyubid dynasty faced emerging pressures from beyond its borders. In the east, the rise of the Mongol Empire would soon alter the balance of power across Eurasia. Though these developments unfolded after Saladin's lifetime, they would test the resilience of the caliphate world he had inhabited. The Abbasid Caliphate itself would eventually fall to Mongol forces in 1258, marking a profound transformation in Islamic political history. Yet during the decades immediately following his death, the system he had shaped continued to function. Egypt and Syria remained under Ayyubid rule. Jerusalem stayed under Muslim governance until later crusading efforts briefly reversed control in the 13th century. The administrative reforms and institutional alignments established under Saladin endured beyond his personal command. His legacy did not depend solely on military victory. It rested equally on his ability to navigate the caliphate structure without destabilizing it. He had neither claimed the caliphal title nor undermined its symbolic authority. Instead, he had operated within that framework, demonstrating that effective rule could coexist with established religious hierarchy. In many ways, his career illustrated the adaptability of medieval Islamic governance. Authority was layered: caliph, sultan, emir, local judge. Loyalty flowed through networks of patronage and legitimacy rather than rigid centralization. Saladin's success lay in aligning these layers toward a common objective without dismantling their foundations. As the 12th century gave way to the 13th, his name remained associated with unity and measured strength. Later generations would reinterpret his life according to their own circumstances. Reformers, nationalists, and scholars in different eras would revisit his example, drawing lessons about leadership, religious responsibility, and political coordination. The world that had shaped him, a world of divided dynasties, competing caliphates, and Crusader enclaves, had not disappeared. It had been reorganized through patience, calculation, and sustained effort. He had transformed fragmentation into a functioning network of authority. His story, when viewed within the larger arc of the Caliphate era, reveals how individual leadership interacted with institutional continuity. He did not invent the structures he used. He inherited them, adapted them, and strengthened them at a moment when coherence was urgently needed. The hills around Jerusalem, the citadel in Cairo, the courts of Damascus, and the distant capital in Baghdad all formed part of the environment in which he operated. His life moved across these spaces with steady purpose rather than dramatic rupture. And though later centuries would bring new challenges that neither he nor his contemporaries could foresee, the memory of his rule remained tied to a particular achievement: the demonstration that unity, even in a divided age, could be constructed through disciplined governance and restrained authority. After Al-Adil consolidated authority at the beginning of the 13th century, the Ayyubid domains regained a measure of coherence. Though not as centralized as under Saladin, the dynasty functioned with clearer hierarchy. Al-Adil redistributed territories among relatives in a manner designed to reduce open rivalry. Egypt remained the principal source of revenue, while Damascus and Aleppo continued as political and military centers in Syria. Al-Adil's reign coincided with shifting currents beyond the eastern Mediterranean. In Europe, crusading energy had turned temporarily away from Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, diverted toward Constantinople, resulting in the capture of the Byzantine capital in 1204. This event altered the balance of power within Christendom and weakened Byzantine influence in the eastern Mediterranean. For the Ayyubids, the immediate threat from a unified European campaign diminished, though coastal Crusader states persisted. Within Ayyubid lands, governance focused on maintaining revenue stability and military readiness. Egypt's agricultural administration remained efficient. Annual measurement of Nile flooding determined taxation assessments. Irrigation networks were maintained carefully as agricultural decline would directly affect the army's funding. Officials responsible for rural districts were monitored to prevent corruption that could undermine long-term productivity. Urban centers experienced continued growth. Cairo expanded beyond its Fatimid foundations. Markets attracted merchants from across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Syrian cities, particularly Damascus, sustained vibrant artisan and scholarly communities. The madrasa system continued to expand, reinforcing Sunni orthodoxy and producing jurists who served in courts and administrative offices. Religious legitimacy remained tied to acknowledgement of the Abbasid Caliph. Baghdad, though politically constrained, symbolized continuity with early Islamic governance. Ayyubid rulers maintained correspondence with the caliphal court, reinforcing the shared framework of Sunni authority. This symbolic unity contributed to diplomatic cohesion among regional powers. The Ayyubid dynasty, however, faced periodic succession disputes. Territories divided among sons and nephews sometimes generated competition. While all had stabilized the realm, his death in 1218 reopened rivalries among his heirs. Nonetheless, the institutional foundations laid earlier prevented immediate collapse. Local governors retained administrative routines and tax systems continued functioning. In 1218, a new crusade targeted Egypt directly. Recognizing Egypt's economic centrality, European forces landed near the Nile Delta and besieged the port city of Damietta. The campaign, later known as the Fifth Crusade, sought to pressure the Ayyubids by controlling a key river outlet. Ayyubid forces responded by reinforcing defensive positions along the Nile. Flood cycles complicated Crusader movement inland. The geography of the delta with its canals and shifting channels favored defenders familiar with terrain. After prolonged struggle, Crusader forces briefly captured Damietta in 1219. Yet internal divisions and logistical challenges hindered their advance toward Cairo. Ayyubid commanders adopted defensive strategies that leveraged seasonal flooding. When Crusader forces attempted to march southward, rising waters disrupted supply lines. Eventually surrounded and weakened, the Crusaders negotiated withdrawal in 1221, returning Damietta in exchange for safe passage. The episode reaffirmed Egypt's resilience and underscored the importance of environmental knowledge in military planning. Meanwhile, in Syria, shifting alliances with Crusader states reflected pragmatic diplomacy. At times, Ayyubid rulers negotiated truces or even territorial exchanges to secure internal stability. In 1229, Sultan Al-Kamel of Egypt entered into negotiations with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II during the Sixth Crusade. Rather than prolonged warfare, diplomacy produced an agreement granting Christians temporary control over parts of Jerusalem while preserving Muslim authority over key religious sites. This treaty reflected a strategic calculation. Al-Sil faced internal Ubaid rivalry and preferred compromise abroad to focus on domestic concerns. The arrangement did not erase tension, but it demonstrated the flexibility within Ayyubid policy. Jerusalem changed hands without major battle, illustrating how political negotiation could substitute for siege. Throughout these decades, the Ubaid realm remained integrated into broader trade networks. Red Sea routes connected Egypt with the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. Indian Ocean commerce brought spices and textiles through Aden and up the Nile corridor. Mediterranean trade linked Alexandria with Italian maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa. Even in periods of conflict, commercial agreements persisted because economic interdependence benefited all parties. In intellectual life, scholars produced works of theology, law, medicine, and geography. Damascus and Cairo hosted physicians whose writings circulated widely. Endowments funded libraries and educational institutions. The Sunni revival that had begun under Nuruddin and been reinforced by Saladin matured into an established scholarly tradition. However, external forces beyond the Mediterranean began reshaping the wider Islamic world. In the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire expanded rapidly across Central Asia. By the 1220s and 1230s, Mongol armies had advanced into regions that connected with the Abbasid sphere. Though Ubaid territories were not immediately invaded, the expansion created uncertainty across the eastern Islamic lands. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad remained symbolically central but militarily vulnerable. As Mongol power extended westward, diplomatic overtures and cautious observation characterized relations. The Ayyubids monitored developments, aware that events in Mesopotamia could eventually affect Syria and Egypt. By the mid-13th century, internal fragmentation within the Ubaid dynasty intensified, competing branches weakened collective defense. In 1244, Jerusalem again changed control after conflict involving regional powers and nomadic groups. Crusader states, though diminished, maintained footholds along the coast. A turning point emerged in Egypt itself. The Ubaid military increasingly relied on Mamluks, enslaved soldiers trained for elite service. These soldiers, often of Turik or Circassian origin, were purchased young, converted to Islam, and educated within military households. Their loyalty centered on commanders rather than dynastic bloodlines. Over time, Mamluk officers gained substantial influence within Egyptian politics. By 1250, following internal disputes and the death of the last effective Ubaid ruler in Egypt, Mamluk commanders assumed power directly. This transition marked the beginning of the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluk regime inherited much of the administrative structure established under the Ubaids: taxation systems, urban institutions, and religious endowments continued functioning with adjustments. The Abbasid Caliphate, meanwhile, faced a catastrophic event. In 1258, Mongol forces captured Baghdad, executing the reigning caliph and ending the Abbasid political line that had existed since the 8th century. The fall of Baghdad transformed the symbolic landscape of the Islamic world. In response, the Mamluks established a ceremonial Abbasid caliph in Cairo to preserve continuity of religious legitimacy. This move echoed earlier patterns in which political authority operated alongside symbolic caliphal presence. Although these events unfolded decades after Salah ad-Din's lifetime, they occurred within the institutional framework he had helped solidify. The emphasis on Sunni orthodoxy, administrative coherence in Egypt and Syria, and recognition of layered authority allowed subsequent regimes to adapt rather than collapse. Under Mamluk rule, Egypt and Syria would successfully repel Mongol advances at the Battle of Angelut in 1260. The memory of earlier unity against external threats resonated in this defense. While dynasties changed, the concept of coordinated regional resistance persisted. Salah ad-Din's era thus functioned as a bridge between fragmentation and later centralized responses to invasion. His approach to legitimacy, serving as sultan under caliph's acknowledgement, became a model for later rulers who balanced symbolic continuity with practical governance. In retrospect, the Ayyubid century represented a period of consolidation and adaptation within the caliphate world. It did not restore a single unified empire under one caliph, yet it demonstrated the durability of institutions even amid dynastic turnover. The cities he had governed, Cairo, Damascus, Jerusalem, continued as focal points of religious and commercial life. The citadel in Cairo expanded under later rulers. The madrasa networks deepened scholarly traditions. Trade routes endured, connecting continents through shared economic interest. His legacy, therefore, extended beyond his personal campaigns. It shaped administrative habits, diplomatic norms, and expectations of leadership within a changing Mediterranean order. The world did not remain static after his death, but the structures he reinforced allowed successors to navigate upheaval with inherited tools. As the 13th century advanced, new powers emerged and older institutions adapted. Yet within the long arc of the caliphate's history, Salah ad-Din's lifetime stood as a period when fragmentation yielded to coordinated authority and when political pragmatism aligned with religious legitimacy to stabilize a divided region. Although the Ayyubid dynasty eventually yielded authority in Egypt to the Mamluks, the broader framework of governance that had taken shape during Salah ad-Din's lifetime continued to influence political thought across the region. The separation between colorful symbolism and sultanic authority, once a practical compromise, became a durable model. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258 and ended the Abbasid caliph's temporal rule, the symbolic center of the Sunni world appeared to collapse. Yet the response in Cairo demonstrated how adaptable the system had become. The Mamluk rulers installed a surviving Ayyubid prince as a ceremonial caliph. While this caliph held no independent military power, his presence restored a sense of religious continuity. This arrangement echoed the structure that had existed during Salah ad-Din's career. A caliph acknowledged for spiritual legitimacy and a sultan exercising executive power. The fact that such a model could be recreated after catastrophic upheaval suggests how firmly it had been embedded into political culture. The Mamluk sultans, many of whom had risen through the same military training system that matured during Ayyubid rule, governed Egypt and Syria with emphasis on military readiness and administrative order. They inherited fortified cities, taxation networks, and trade connections developed in earlier decades. Cairo remained a thriving metropolis enriched by Mediterranean and Red Sea commerce. Jerusalem continued under Muslim administration for most of this period, though it no longer functioned as a political capital. Its significance remained religious rather than strategic. Pilgrimage routes were protected and religious endowments maintained key institutions across the eastern Mediterranean. Crusader states gradually weakened. One by one, their coastal enclaves fell to Mamluk campaigns in the late 13th century. By 1291, the fall of Acre ended the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant. Nearly 2 centuries after the First Crusade, the Latin Christian presence as a territorial power in the region had concluded. This long arc from fragmentation to consolidation to renewed stability cannot be attributed solely to a single individual. Yet Salah ad-Din's period marked the critical phase when sustained unity became operational reality. Later rulers built upon that precedent. In intellectual life, scholars reflected on the relationship between ruler and law. Legal theorists examined the responsibilities of sultans toward justice, taxation, and defense. Chroniclers recorded earlier campaigns, preserving narratives that shaped collective memory. Salah ad-Din's conduct during the recapture of Jerusalem remained central in these accounts. In Europe, interest in the Eastern Mediterranean did not disappear. Trade persisted. Pilgrimage continued in various forms. Literary traditions romanticized crusading encounters. Within these narratives, Salah ad-Din appeared not only as adversary but as a figure embodying discipline and measured authority. Medieval European writers occasionally portrayed him as a model of chivalry's virtue, a reflection of cross-cultural observation shaped by prolonged contact. Meanwhile, within the Islamic world, his name became associated with unity under Sunni leadership. Later rulers invoked his example when confronting foreign threat or internal division. His image functioned as political reference point rather than mythic abstraction. The broader caliphate world continued to evolve. After the Mongol invasion, new powers emerged in Anatolia and Persia. Eventually, the Ottoman dynasty would rise, adopting the title of Sultan and later Caliph, extending authority across territories once contested in the 12th century. The institutional separation between Caliph and Sultan, refined during Salah ad-Din's time, informed later Ottoman governance. In Egypt and Syria, urban continuity remained strong. Cairo's citadel expanded into a complex administrative center. Damascus retained its role as provincial capital and scholarly hub. Architectural patronage reflected successive dynasties' desire to demonstrate legitimacy through visible public works. Trade routes linking the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean grew increasingly significant. Spices, textiles, metals, and manuscripts moved through ports controlled by Muslim authorities and negotiated with European merchants. Even when political rivalry existed, economic exchange rarely ceased entirely. By the late medieval period, the immediate memory of the Crusades receded into longer historical perspective. Yet, the institutional lessons of the 12th and 13th centuries endured. Political authority required more than battlefield success. It depended on sustained administrative cohesion and negotiated legitimacy. In modern centuries, interpretations of Salah ad-Din shifted again. 19th and 20th century reformers in the Middle East looked back to his example when confronting colonial expansion. His unification of Egypt and Syria was reimagined as early expression of regional solidarity. Leaders invoked his name to symbolize resistance grounded in disciplined governance rather than impulsive revolt. Historians examining primary sources emphasized the administrative depth behind his campaigns. Surviving letters, fiscal records, and contemporary chronicles reveal a ruler attentive to structure as much as to strategy. His court integrated military officers, jurists, and administrators within a shared framework of accountability. The caliphate world he inhabited was neither static nor monolithic. It contained ethnic diversity: Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Armenians, Persians, and religious plurality, including Sunni and Shia Muslims, Christians of various denominations, and Jewish communities. Governance required coordination across these lines. Salah ad-Din's approach did not eliminate diversity. It organized it within a hierarchy that emphasized Sunni legitimacy and political pragmatism. In doing so, he strengthened coherence without imposing uniformity across all local practices. As centuries passed, the medieval frontier between Crusader and Muslim states became a subject of scholarship rather than immediate policy. Archaeological remains of fortresses, citadels, and urban walls testify to the intensity of that period. Many of those structures trace their reinforcement to the decades of consolidation under Ayyubid and early Mamluk rule. In the long perspective of Islamic political history, the 12th century appears as a transitional era. The early caliphates had once combined spiritual and political authority in a single office. By Salah ad-Din's time, that unity had fragmented. His career demonstrated how functional governance could operate within symbolic continuity rather than restoring earlier imperial forms. He did not attempt to claim universal authority over all Muslim lands. Instead, he focused on regions where consolidation was achievable. By aligning Egypt and Syria under coordinated leadership, they formed a strong alliance. He shifted the strategic balance in the Eastern Mediterranean without dismantling the broader caliphal framework. The endurance of his administrative model through subsequent dynasties suggests that his contribution lay as much in institutional clarity as in military outcome. Later sultans, whether Ayyubid, Mamluk, or Ottoman, would adopt variations of the same layered authority. Religious legitimacy acknowledged executive power exercised pragmatically. Today his name remains associated with a period when political fragmentation yielded to coordinated governance during a sustained external challenge. That reputation reflects both historical record and the shaping influence of centuries of narrative. In tracing the arc from his early years in a divided Syria to the lasting institutional patterns that followed, one sees how personal discipline interacted with inherited structures. He neither rejected the caliphate nor sought to replace it. Instead, he worked within its symbolic framework to strengthen practical rule. The world of the 12th century was complex and unsettled. Through gradual consolidation, careful diplomacy, and sustained administrative reform, Saladin left behind more than a battlefield victory. He demonstrated how authority could be stabilized within a fractured landscape. 2. Understand the enduring weight of Saladin's career. It is necessary to return once more to the frontier that shaped so much of his life. The long border between the Muslim polities of Egypt and Syria, and the Latin Christian states established after the First Crusade. That frontier was not a simple line on a map. It was a shifting zone of fortresses, market towns, agricultural estates, and negotiated trusses. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, founded in 1099, had developed into a layered society by the mid-12th century. Latin nobles held castles and estates, yet they governed populations that included Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Arabic and French could both be heard in markets. Trade agreements crossed religious boundaries. Despite ideological hostility, practical coexistence was routine in many areas. This environment shaped Saladin's strategic thinking. He did not face a monolithic enemy, but a collection of principalities often divided by internal disputes. The County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem maintained separate leadership. Rivalries among them sometimes limited coordinated defense. Border warfare during the decades before Hattin often consisted of raids rather than decisive battles. Castles such as Kerak and Montreal in Ultra-Ordain controlled caravan routes linking Syria and Egypt. Control of these fortifications meant influence over trade and pilgrimage traffic. Real of Shashan's attacks on caravans were not isolated acts of violence. They represented attempts to disrupt economic arteries. Saladin's response to such provocations was shaped by calculation. He sought not immediate retaliation, but conditions that would justify broader mobilization. When he finally gathered forces for the campaign of 1187, it was after years of preparation and diplomatic positioning. The victory at Hattin dismantled the Crusader field army. Yet it did not immediately erase Latin presence from the Levant. Coastal fortresses supported by European fleets remained resilient. The geography of the coastline allowed maritime reinforcement even when inland routes were cut. During the Third Crusade, Richard I demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined infantry formations supported by naval supply. The battles along the coast showed that neither side possessed permanent dominance. Control fluctuated based on logistics and seasonal conditions. This pattern continued beyond Saladin's lifetime. Crusader states survived in reduced form, confined largely to coastal enclaves. Muslim rulers alternated between siege and truce, recognizing that complete eradication required sustained naval capacity and unified command. The frontier therefore functioned as a zone of adaptation. Military architecture evolved on both sides. Crusader castles incorporated concentric walls and advanced gate systems. Muslim fortifications integrated lessons learned from European siege techniques. Engineers and craftsmen observed and adapted methods across cultural lines. Economic exchange persisted despite ideological rivalry. Italian merchant republics maintained commercial quarters in Muslim-controlled ports. Spices and textiles flowed westward. Timber and metal goods moved eastward. Customs duties provided revenue for rulers on both sides. Within this setting, diplomacy often accompanied warfare. Agreements allowed pilgrim access to Jerusalem, even when sovereignty shifted. Prisoners were ransomed, according to established conventions. Envoys crossed battle lines carrying proposals and counter-proposals. Saladin's conduct during the recapture of Jerusalem reflected awareness of the long-term implications of policy. Allowing ransom rather than massacre reduced the likelihood of immediate retaliatory brutality and maintained economic functionality in the city. This approach contrasted with the violence recorded during the Crusader conquest of 1999, though medieval warfare on all sides could be severe under different circumstances. The frontier also influenced intellectual exchange. Translations of scientific and philosophical works moved through contact zones in Spain and Sicily as well as the Levant. While the Eastern Mediterranean was primarily a military frontier, it formed part of a broader pattern of cross-cultural interaction. For Muslim chroniclers, the Crusader presence was described as occupation of lands long integrated into Islamic governance. For European chroniclers, the same territories were viewed as sacred inheritance requiring defense. These competing narratives shaped public support for continued campaigns. Over time, fatigue affected both sides. Prolonged mobilization strained resources. Leadership changes in Europe redirected priorities. In the Islamic world, new threats such as the Mongols shifted attention eastward. By the late 13th century, Mamluk campaigns methodically dismantled the remaining Crusader enclaves. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the effective end of Latin territorial power in the Levant. Coastal fortresses were either destroyed or repurposed. Trade continued, but political sovereignty shifted decisively. Looking back across this frontier history, Salah ad-Din's role appears as a pivotal phase rather than a final chapter. He transformed a fragmented Muslim political landscape into coordinated resistance at a moment when Crusader states appeared entrenched. His campaigns altered the trajectory of the region. Yet, they did not immediately resolve its complexities. The caliphate framework within which he operated provided ideological cohesion. By aligning his rule with Abbasid legitimacy, he ensured that mobilization carried broader resonance beyond local ambition. This connection between symbolic authority and practical governance proved durable. In European memory, crusading narratives gradually shifted from immediate political concern to literary tradition. Romanticized accounts of encounters between Richard and Salah ad-Din circulated in later centuries. These stories sometimes emphasized mutual respect, reflecting how distance softened earlier hostilities within the Islamic tradition. Chronicles emphasized restoration of Jerusalem and defense of pilgrimage routes. His campaigns were recorded not simply as military episodes, but as fulfillment of communal obligation. The frontier itself eventually stabilized under Ottoman rule in the 16th century. When the Ottomans absorbed Egypt and Syria, they inherited fortifications, administrative systems, and patterns of trade shaped by earlier centuries. The Calipal title would eventually be claimed by Ottoman sultans, uniting symbolic and executive authority once more under a single dynasty. Thus, the world that produced Salah ad-Din did not vanish with his death. It evolved through adaptation. Political fragmentation yielded to successive waves of consolidation. The layered relationship between Caliph and Sultan persisted in different forms. In tracing the arc of the Crusader frontier and the Caliphate world, one sees how individual leadership intersects with structural forces. Salah ad-Din neither created the frontier nor ended it alone. Yet his consolidation of Egypt and Syria shifted the balance at a critical moment. The hills of Galilee, the citadels of Cairo, and the ports of Acre became part of a longer story of contest and exchange. Within that story, his life stands as a demonstration of how disciplined governance can reshape a divided region. The frontier he faced required patience as much as courage, negotiation as much as force. His career reflected those realities, grounding reputation not only in decisive battle, but in sustained administrative coherence. Beyond the campaigns and treaties, the internal structure of Salah ad-Din's realm reveals the foundations that made sustained resistance possible. Military victory at Hattin rested upon years of fiscal organization, recruitment planning, and disciplined governance. Without that groundwork, battlefield coordination would have been fragile. The army he commanded was not a single ethnic force, but a composite of Kurds, Turks, Arabs, and other groups drawn from across Egypt and Syria. Cavalry units formed the core striking power. Light horse archers provided mobility while infantry secured fortifications and supply lines. Recruitment relied on IQTA grants, land assignments given in exchange for military service. These grants provided revenue to commanders and ensured readiness without requiring constant direct salary payment from the central treasury. This system, inherited from earlier Seljuk practice and refined in Ayyubid administration, created a distributed yet accountable military structure. Landholders were obligated to provide troops when summoned. Oversight prevented hereditary entrenchment from undermining central authority. Salah ad-Din monitored appointments carefully, balancing family loyalty with merit. Financial administration required steady revenue collection. Egypt's agricultural taxation remained essential. Officials recorded harvest yields, assessed obligations, and transmitted surplus to state granaries. In Syria, urban taxes and customs duties supplemented income. Trade tariffs from Mediterranean ports contributed additional funds. Saladin did not pursue dramatic fiscal experimentation. Stability rather than innovation characterized his approach. Excessive taxation risked unrest, insufficient collection, weakened military readiness. Maintaining equilibrium required consistent oversight. Judicial administration operated alongside fiscal governance. Cadis or judges presided over legal matters according to Sunni jurists' prudence. Their independence reinforced legitimacy. While the Sultan commanded armies, legal scholars upheld moral authority. This division of responsibility strengthened institutional trust. Religious endowments known as WAF funded schools, hospitals, and mosques. Saladin expanded such endowments, especially in Cairo and Damascus. These institutions trained scholars and administrators who would serve the state. Education was therefore integrated into governance rather than separate from it. Communication across territories depended on established routes. Couriers carried messages between Cairo and Damascus through the Sinai and along coastal highways. Fortified way stations ensured safe passage. Rapid information exchange allowed coordinated mobilization during crisis. Naval capacity, though less prominent than land forces, played a role in defending Mediterranean ports and Red Sea trade routes. Egyptian shipyards constructed vessels capable of patrolling coastal waters. Naval readiness limited Crusader freedom of movement along the Nile Delta. The social fabric of the realm remained diverse. Christian communities in Syria continued religious practice under agreed conditions. Jewish populations returned to Jerusalem after 1187. Their presence reflected economic as well as religious considerations. Stability required accommodation within structured hierarchy. Markets operated under regulation to prevent hoarding and maintain fair pricing. Inspectors known as mutibs monitored commercial activity. Urban order depended on enforcement of standards in weights, measures, and sanitation. Saladin's court functioned as both administrative center and symbolic authority. Advisors included military commanders, jurists, secretaries, and family members. Deliberation preceded major decisions. Chroniclers describe consultation as a recurring element of his leadership style, reinforcing perception of measured judgment. His personal conduct, as recorded by contemporaries such as Ibn Shad, emphasized modesty in daily life. He reportedly preferred simple attire and avoided ostentatious display, whether entirely factual or partially shaped by admiration. These portrayals supported his reputation for disciplined restraint. During periods between campaigns, he devoted attention to reviewing provincial reports and ensuring that officials met obligations. Corruption threatened long-term stability. Oversight mitigated that risk. Administrative continuity during wartime distinguished his governance from more episodic military leaders. The relationship between center and province required constant negotiation. Local elites retained influence over agricultural estates and urban guilds. Saladin avoided unnecessary displacement of established authority by incorporating rather than replacing regional leadership. He reduced resistance. Military mobilization during the campaign of 1187 illustrated the effectiveness of these systems. When summons were issued, forces assembled from distant territories with relative cohesion. Supplies were staged in advance. Coordination across commanders reflected prior planning rather than improvisation. The same infrastructure supported defense during the Third Crusade, even after the setback at Acre. And the engagement at Arsoft, the core administrative framework remained intact. Loss of a city did not dismantle the revenue system supporting the army. In analyzing the caliphate world of the 12th century, one observes that legitimacy derived from layered authority rather than centralized absolutism. The caliph symbolized continuity with early Islamic governance. The Sultan exercised executive command. Judges interpreted law. Military officers held conditional land grants. Merchants sustained trade networks. Each layer reinforced the others. Saladin operated within this matrix rather than attempting to restructure it entirely. His contribution lay in aligning these elements toward unified purpose at a moment when fragmentation threatened coherence. The durability of his model becomes clearer when considering subsequent transitions after his death. Despite internal rivalry, administrative systems persisted. Even when the Mamluks replaced the Ubayds in Egypt, they inherited intact fiscal and judicial frameworks. Such continuity suggests that his reign was not an isolated episode, but part of a larger institutional evolution. The caliphate as spiritual symbol endured through adaptation. The Sultanate as executive authority matured into a recognized office across regions. When later historians assessed his life, they often emphasized military triumph. Yet the sustained functionality of governance under his leadership provided the foundation for those triumphs. Without reliable revenue and coordinated command, battlefield success would have been temporary. The 12th century Eastern Mediterranean required leaders capable of integrating military, fiscal, and religious authority. Salah ad-Din's life demonstrates how these components interacted. His early service under Nur ad-Din exposed him to disciplined administration. His tenure in Egypt demanded fiscal stabilization. His consolidation of Syria required diplomatic accommodation. By the time he faced the Crusader coalition at Hattin and later Richard I, he commanded not merely an army but an organized state apparatus. As centuries advanced and new dynasties arose, the principle that executive authority could coexist with symbolic caliph legitimacy remained influential. The Ottoman adoption of both sultanic and caliphal titles in later centuries represents one culmination of that pattern. In reflecting on this institutional architecture, the figure of Salah ad-Din appears less as solitary hero and more as integrator of existing structures at a decisive moment. He did not dismantle the caliphate. He reinforced its symbolic role while strengthening the Sultanate's operational capacity. If one steps back from the chronicles and looks instead at the rhythm of daily life within Salah ad-Din's realm, another layer of his era becomes visible. Wars and treaties shaped borders. But most people experienced his rule through taxation schedules, market regulations, judicial rulings, and the quiet assurance that caravans could travel with relative safety. In Egypt, the Nile remained the measure of prosperity. Each year, officials recorded the height of the flood. A strong inundation meant abundant harvest. A weak one required careful management of reserves. The fiscal system that Salah ad-Din preserved depended on accurate assessment of agricultural yield. Village headmen coordinated with state representatives to ensure that obligations were met without excessive strain. Stability in this system underwrote the army's existence. Cairo itself expanded gradually during the Ayyubid period. The old Fatimid palaces were repurposed. The citadel overlooking the city became the administrative heart, housing garrisons and officials. Construction projects provided employment and reinforced visible authority. Markets thrived in districts connected to Mediterranean trade and Red Sea routes. In Damascus, orchards and irrigation channels supported a dense urban population. Artisans produced textiles, metalwork and ceramics. Scholars gathered in newly endowed madrasas. Friday sermons reflected Sunni orthodoxy, affirming alignment with Baghdad's caliphal tradition. For many residents, the shift from previous rulers to Ayyubid governance manifested not in dramatic upheaval, but in gradual institutional continuity. Jerusalem after 1187 required careful integration. Salah ad-Din confirmed Christian custodianship of certain churches while re-establishing Muslim religious administration at key sites. Jewish families returned, contributing to commercial life. The city's multi-religious character resumed under structured hierarchy. Pilgrims from different traditions entered under regulated conditions. Such arrangements were not expressions of modern pluralism but pragmatic governance within medieval norms. Protection was extended in exchange for acknowledgement of Muslim political supremacy and payment of required taxes. The objective was order rather than assimilation. Military readiness remained constant. Garrisons rotated between cities and frontier castles. Officers reported to regional commanders who in turn communicated with the central administration. When no large campaign was underway, training and maintenance filled the schedule. Horses required care, weapons required upkeep, preparedness depended on routine. The Akar system continued distributing land revenues to officers in return for service. This arrangement linked agricultural productivity directly to military capacity. Over time, oversight mechanisms developed to prevent permanent entrenchment of local magnates. Central review of assignments preserved the Sultan's leverage. Religious life intertwined with governance. Judges interpreted law in civil disputes. Scholars debated jurist credential nuances. Public endowments funded hospitals that provided treatment without charge. Charitable distribution during periods of scarcity reinforced legitimacy. Salah ad-Din's personal engagement with these structures was recorded by contemporaries. He reportedly reviewed correspondence late into the night and attended to petitions personally when possible. While some details may reflect admiration, the consistency of such accounts suggests that accessibility formed part of his public image. The Caliph in Baghdad remained distant geographically but present symbolically. Coins minted in Egypt and Syria bore the Caliph's name alongside that of the Sultan. This pairing communicated layered authority to merchants and subjects alike. Political power operated locally. Spiritual continuity extended beyond regional borders. Diplomatic relations extended beyond Crusader states. Contacts with rulers in Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and North Africa reflected shared interests and occasional rivalry. Marriage alliances reinforced political ties within the Ayyubid family network. The broader Mediterranean climate influenced strategy. Seasonal winds determined naval movement. Summer shaped campaign timing. Agricultural cycles constrained mobilization. Governance required awareness of environmental realities as much as military ambition. When the Third Crusade ended in negotiated truce, daily life resumed in territories long accustomed to tension. Trade caravans returned to accustomed routes. Pilgrims resumed travel under agreed protections. Fortifications remained staffed but quiet. Saladin's final months spent in Damascus illustrate the transition from constant campaign to administrative focus. Illness limited his activity, yet reports indicate continued concern for public matters. Upon his death in 1193, chroniclers noted modest personal wealth, suggesting that resources had been directed towards state and charity rather than accumulation. His burial in Damascus marked the close of a career defined by integration rather than spectacle. The tomb, simple compared to monumental morale of other rulers, reflected both personal disposition and contemporary norms. After his passing, divisions among heirs altered political cohesion, but did not erase institutional foundations. Courts continued operating. Tax collection proceeded. Markets remained open. The structure he had strengthened proved resilient enough to endure transition. In the centuries that followed, travelers described cities shaped by Ayyubid and Mamluk governance. Scholars referenced legal precedents established during his time. Administrators inherited patterns of record-keeping and land assignment refined in his era. The Caliphate world remained complex, subject to new invasions and shifting alliances. Yet the 12th century stood as demonstration that regional consolidation could be achieved without dismantling inherited legitimacy. In examining everyday administration alongside military campaigns, one perceives the balance that defined his rule. He did not abandon institutional continuity in pursuit of conquest, nor did he neglect defense in favor of bureaucratic stability. Instead, he aligned both toward a common objective. This integration explains why his memory endured beyond immediate conflict. His achievements were embedded not only in chronicles of battle, but in functioning systems that outlasted his lifetime. The quiet persistence of courts, schools, and markets across Egypt and Syria serves as testimony to that deeper impact. Long after armies withdrew from the fields of Galilee, the routines of governance continued under frameworks he had reinforced. In considering the final dimension of Saladin's place within the Caliphate world, attention turns to the nature of authority itself in the 12th century. His career illustrates how leadership was negotiated rather than assumed and how legitimacy depended on alignment between personal capacity and inherited institutions. The Caliphate by his lifetime no longer exercised centralized imperial control across all Muslim lands. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad retained spiritual authority recognized in sermons and coinage. Yet, military power rested with regional dynasties. This separation might have produced permanent fragmentation. Instead, it allowed adaptable forms of governance to emerge. Saladin's acceptance of the sultanic title rather than claim to the caliphate reflected strategic restraint. By positioning himself as protector and executive rather than spiritual sovereign, he avoided contesting established legitimacy. His authority derived from service acknowledged by the Caliphate, reinforcing continuity. This layered structure also facilitated diplomatic flexibility. When negotiating with Crusader rulers, he spoke as sovereign commander. When communicating with Baghdad, he emphasized loyalty. The dual posture preserved stability across audiences. The unification of Egypt and Syria did not erase regional diversity. Each province retained administrative habits shaped by earlier rulers. Saladin's achievement lay in coordinating these provinces without dismantling local expertise. That balance between central direction and regional autonomy proved durable. His governance demonstrated that effective rule required integration of military readiness with economic sustainability. Campaigns were financed through predictable taxation rather than sudden levies. Garrisons were supplied through established logistics rather than improvised requisition. In examining the long trajectory of Islamic political history, scholars identify recurring tension between symbolic unity and practical decentralization. Saladin's era represents a moment when that tension was managed productively. The caliph remained spiritual figurehead. The Sultan acted as executive authority. Subsequent centuries would test this arrangement under new conditions. Mongol invasion, Mamluk consolidation, Ottoman expansion all operated within frameworks shaped by earlier adaptations. Though dynasties changed, the principle that legitimacy flowed through layered recognition endured. Saladin's Kurdish heritage and service within predominantly Turkish-led military structures reflect another characteristic of his era: mobility within elite ranks. Ethnic origin did not prevent advancement when loyalty and competence were demonstrated. Service under Nur ad-Din provided pathway to prominence. Governance in Egypt provided platform for expansion. His life also illustrates the importance of mentorship within medieval political culture. Without Nur ad-Din's patronage, his rise might have been delayed or diverted. Yet, when opportunity emerged after his patron's death, he navigated transition without dismantling the broader vision of unity. In Jerusalem, his policies combined symbolic restoration with administrative order. Religious sites were respected according to negotiated arrangements. Urban continuity prevented economic collapse. These decisions influenced how his rule was remembered beyond immediate military outcome. The Third Crusade revealed limits of decisive victory. Even after Hattin, European monarchs could mobilize substantial force. His response, avoiding catastrophic engagement after setbacks and accepting negotiated truce, demonstrated strategic patience. In final years, attention shifted from expansion to consolidation. Illness curtailed campaign activity, yet governance continued. His modest personal estate at death reinforced perception that resources had been directed toward public rather than private accumulation. Later, historians interpret his career within broader context of state formation in the medieval Near East. They note how administrative centralization in Egypt provided a stable base for Syrian campaigns. They analyze how religious reform in Cairo strengthened Sunni alignment across provinces. The caliphate world that followed his death faced challenges he could not have anticipated. Yet the resilience displayed during subsequent crises owes something to the institutional strengthening accomplished in his lifetime. In modern historical study, emphasis on structural forces complements narrative of individual agency. Saladin's rise was made possible by preceding fragmentation and by mentorship under established authority. His success required alignment between inherited systems and personal discipline. Across centuries, his name has been invoked in diverse contexts. For some, he symbolizes unity under shared faith. For others, he represents pragmatic governance amid ideological conflict. Scholars continue to debate details of his campaigns, finances, and diplomacy. Yet certain conclusions remain stable. He unified Egypt and Syria under coordinated rule. He ended the Fatimid Caliphate and reinforced Sunni orthodoxy. He recaptured Jerusalem through an organized campaign and negotiated its transfer with relative restraint. He resisted a major European crusade and concluded truce preserving key objectives. These achievements were not isolated events but components of broader administrative project. They demonstrate how leadership within caliphate framework could restore coherence without dismantling symbolic continuity. The 12th century Eastern Mediterranean was marked by contest and exchange, conflict and accommodation. Saladin's life intersected each of these dimensions. His career stands as case study in how institutional adaptation can shape historical trajectory. As memory of his campaigns traveled through chronicle and legend, the underlying systems he strengthened continued functioning. Courts adjudicated disputes under Sunni law. Markets facilitated trade across religious boundaries. Garrisoned fortresses guarded frontiers. In tracing the arc from a Kurdish boy born in Tikrit to a sultan acknowledged across Egypt and Syria, one observes gradual accumulation of authority rather than sudden transformation. His rise followed service, governance, consolidation, and measured confrontation. The caliphate world did not become unified empire under his hand. yet it achieved coherence sufficient to alter balance with Crusader states and to endure subsequent transitions within the broader history of the Middle East. His lifetime marks a moment when fragmentation yielded to structured coordination. That coordination, grounded in institutional continuity, remains central to understanding his enduring reputation. When examining the wider Mediterranean context of Saladin's era, it becomes clear that his achievements unfolded within a network of interconnected powers rather than in isolation. The Eastern Mediterranean was a corridor linking Europe, North Africa, Anatolia, and the Near East. Political shifts in one region often influenced developments in another. The Byzantine Empire, though diminished compared to earlier centuries, remained a significant presence during his lifetime. Constantinople maintained diplomatic contact with both Crusader states and Muslim rulers. Byzantine emperors sometimes negotiated with Damascus or Cairo to counterbalance Latin influence. These interactions added further complexity to regional politics. In Anatolia, Turkish principalities emerged from the earlier Seljuk framework. Some aligned with Muslim powers in Syria, others pursued independent agendas. Control of mountain passes and trade routes through Anatolia influenced the movement of Crusader armies and merchant caravans alike. North Africa maintained its own dynastic landscape, with Almohad authority rising in the western Mediterranean during the 12th century. Although geographically distant from Saladin's central territories, the broader Islamic world shared intellectual and commercial exchange across these regions. The Mediterranean Sea itself functioned as conduit rather than barrier. Italian maritime republics Venice, Genoa, Pisa established trading quarters in ports under Muslim as well as Crusader control. Economic pragmatism frequently overrode ideological conflict. Customs duties from such trade provided revenue for rulers on both sides. This environment required leaders capable of navigating overlapping interests. Saladin's diplomatic engagements extended beyond battlefield opponents. Envoys traveled between courts carrying gifts, proposals, and letters that reinforced political communication. Within his territories, coinage reflected integration into this wider network. Gold dinars minted in Egypt circulated broadly, valued for consistent weight and purity. Stable currency facilitated long-distance trade and enhanced fiscal reliability. Agricultural production in Egypt, particularly grain, remained vital not only for local consumption, but for export. Syrian cities relied on imports during lean seasons. Control over grain routes thus reinforced political leverage. Legal administration supported commercial confidence. Merchants required assurance that contracts would be enforced and disputes resolved fairly. The judicial system, staffed by trained qadis, provided this assurance within Sunni legal tradition. Educational institutions contributed indirectly to governance. Madrasas produced administrators literate in legal and fiscal procedure. The emphasis on scholarship under Nuruddin and strengthened by Saladin cultivated an elite capable of sustaining state functions. When the Third Crusade unfolded, the scale of European mobilization demonstrated how events in the Levant reverberated across distant courts. Richard I's participation reflected political calculations in England and France. European monarchs balanced internal rivalries with crusading commitment. Saladin's measured response to Richard's advance illustrates awareness of logistical realities. He recognized that European forces operating far from home depended on maritime supply. By avoiding unnecessary confrontation and preserving his core forces, he prolonged the campaign until negotiation became practical. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 exemplified this pragmatic diplomacy. It did not declare permanent peace, yet it established terms under which pilgrims could access Jerusalem while coastal territories remained contested. Such arrangements illustrate the layered nature of medieval conflict. Ideological rhetoric coexisted with negotiated compromise. In examining his final months, chroniclers emphasize continued administrative concern despite declining health. Reports describe him allocating funds for charitable distribution and ensuring payment of outstanding obligations. These details, though filtered through narrative perspective, reinforce impression of governance grounded in responsibility. After his death, the division of territories among heirs revealed both strength and vulnerability of dynastic arrangement. While family appointments secured loyalty during his lifetime, they also introduced centrifugal pressures once central authority receded. The subsequent rise of the Mamluks in Egypt reflected evolution of military structure originally strengthened under Ayyubid rule. Mamluk officers trained within elite households eventually assumed direct control, yet they preserved many administrative patterns inherited from their predecessors. Across centuries, historians continue to assess the balance between individual agency and structural continuity in his career. His unification of Egypt and Syria was not predetermined. It resulted from calculated decisions at moments of transition. Yet it succeeded because institutional frameworks were sufficiently adaptable. The caliphate world of the 12th century was marked by fragmentation, but also by shared intellectual and legal tradition. Saladin operated within that tradition, aligning military expansion with religious legitimacy recognized beyond his own territories. In modern analysis, his life invites reflection on how political authority can be consolidated without erasing pluralism. His realm encompassed multiple ethnic groups and religious communities. Governance required accommodation within hierarchical framework rather than enforced uniformity. The cities that form the core of his domain, Cairo, Damascus, Jerusalem, remained central to regional history long after his death. Their endurance reflects the depth of institutional investment during his era. His legacy thus occupies a middle space between legend and structural history. While literary traditions emphasize chivalry's virtue or heroic unity, archival research reveals fiscal reform, land assignment oversight, and judicial consultation. Taken together, these dimensions present a portrait of leadership responsive to circumstance, yet anchored in inherited legitimacy. He neither dismantled the caliphate nor claimed spiritual supremacy. Instead, he reinforced the distinction between symbolic authority and executive command. As the centuries unfolded, this distinction proved resilient. Later, empires would reinterpret it according to new conditions, but its 12th century articulation shaped political culture across regions once governed by him. Through careful administration, strategic patience, and disciplined consolidation, Saladin influenced not only the outcome of a specific conflict, but the structure within which subsequent rulers operated. His life situated within the broader Mediterranean and Caliphate world demonstrates how governance grounded in continuity can redirect historical trajectory without severing connection to inherited tradition. In the quiet after long years of campaigning, when letters rather than banners moved between cities, Saladin's final season unfolded in Damascus. The city had become both administrative center and personal refuge. Its orchards and courtyards stood in contrast to the arid fields where armies had gathered. Yet even in these surroundings, governance did not pause. Reports continued to arrive from Egypt regarding Nile levels and revenue assessments. Provincial officials submitted updates on fortifications and troop rotations. Diplomatic correspondence with neighboring rulers required response. Illness limited his physical presence, but not the machinery of administration he had helped to refine. Chroniclers record that during these final weeks he suffered from fever. Physicians attended him according to medical knowledge of the time, drawing upon established traditions of Gaelic and Islamic medicine. Remedies focused on balancing humors and easing symptoms. There is no indication of sudden catastrophe, rather a gradual decline typical of infectious illness. Visitors were received in limited number. Scholars and officers came to offer respect. The atmosphere was described as orderly rather than chaotic. No immediate succession crisis erupted at his bedside. Arrangements for territorial distribution had already been discussed among family members. When he died in March 1193, at approximately 55 years of age, the reaction in Damascus was solemn. Funeral rites followed established custom. His burial took place near the Umayyad Mosque, a site deeply associated with the city's long Islamic history. Accounts describing his personal estate note modest remaining funds. Whether entirely precise or somewhat stylized, such reports reinforced narrative of ruler who had prioritized state expenditure and charitable distribution over personal accumulation. The symbolism of limited wealth at death resonated strongly in later memory. Following his burial, the division of territories proceeded. Al-Afdal retained Damascus. Al-Aziz governed Egypt. Azza held Aleppo. Other relatives managed additional provinces. Although rivalry emerged in subsequent years, the transition itself did not immediately unravel the structure of governance. The institutions of taxation, judicial administration, and military organization continued functioning under Ayyubid rule. Coins were minted bearing the names of new sultans alongside the Abbasid Caliph. Friday sermons invoked the same symbolic authority that had framed Salah ad-Din's legitimacy. In Egypt, the citadel overlooking Cairo remained operational hub. Grain assessments followed established patterns. Trade through Alexandria continued with Italian merchants. Syrian cities maintained commercial and scholarly life without abrupt disruption. The Crusader states observed developments carefully. Though their military capacity had been weakened, they still held coastal strongholds. The absence of Salah ad-Din did not immediately reverse territorial gains of 1187, but it altered balance of leadership. Within a few years, Aladil Salah ad-Din's brother emerged as central figure capable of re-establishing cohesion among divided territories. His eventual consolidation of authority restored a degree of unity, though the dynasty never fully replicated the singular coordination achieved under its founder. The legacy of Salah ad-Din's governance therefore became intertwined with lessons about succession. Personal authority, even when supported by institutional strength, could not guarantee seamless continuity without careful dynastic planning. Medieval political culture often favored distribution among heirs, a practice that risked fragmentation. Yet the resilience of administrative systems mitigated this risk, even when rulers changed, fiscal and judicial frameworks persisted. Such continuity suggests that his reforms had penetrated beyond surface command. Over the decades following his death, chroniclers continued to compile accounts of his life. They emphasize moments of measured conduct, the treatment of captives, the negotiated surrender of Jerusalem, the consultation of scholars. These episodes shaped ethical evaluation of rulership in later literature. European narratives also preserved memory of his encounter with Richard I. Medieval romances sometimes depicted exchanges of courtesy or chivalry respect, reflecting fascination with adversary who combined strength and restraint. In the Islamic world, political thinkers referenced his consolidation of Egypt and Syria as example of necessary unity under external threat. His life became touchstone for discussions of jihad, understood not solely as battle, but as organized defense guided by law. Centuries later, as new empires rose and fell, his tomb in Damascus remained a quiet reminder of that earlier consolidation. Travelers visiting the city recorded impressions of the site, noting its simplicity compared to monumental morale of other rulers. Modern scholarship continues to reassess primary sources, comparing chronicles written by contemporaries with archaeological evidence and fiscal documents. This ongoing research refines his understanding of his policies and corrects exaggerations where necessary. Despite variations in interpretation, consensus holds that his reign marked turning point in the Crusader era. He altered strategic balance by unifying resources previously divided. He restored Sunni alignment in Egypt and strengthened Abbasid's symbolic authority. The Abbasid Caliphate, whose spiritual authority he had upheld, fell politically in 1258 when Mongol forces captured Baghdad. That event ended a line of caliphs stretching back to the 8th century. Yet the concept of caliphal legitimacy did not vanish in Cairo under Mamluk patronage. A ceremonial Abbasid caliph was installed. This restoration did not replicate earlier imperial power, but it preserved symbolic continuity. The Sultan governed. The caliph conferred legitimacy. This arrangement echoed the structure within which Salah ad-Din had operated. His acceptance of sultanic authority under Abbasid recognition had helped solidify the distinction between executive command and spiritual leadership. That distinction proved adaptable in the face of catastrophic upheaval. The Mamluks who rose to power in Egypt in 1250 inherited administrative systems shaped during Ubaid rule. They maintained fiscal oversight of the Nile Valley, preserved judicial institutions and fortified cities across Syria. When Mongol armies advanced westward, the Mamluks defeated them at the Battle of Anjalut in 1260, securing Syria and Egypt from further incursion. The institutional continuity that allowed such mobilization drew upon patterns established in earlier decades. By the late 13th century, the remaining Crusader enclaves fell to Mamluk campaigns. Acre's capture in 1291 ended Latin territorial power in the Levant. Nearly 200 years after the First Crusade, the frontier that had defined Salah ad-Din's era shifted decisively. Yet the memory of his consolidation endured beyond the disappearance of Crusader states. Ottoman historians in later centuries incorporated his career into broader narrative of defending sacred geography. When the Ottoman sultans formally adopted the title of Caliph in the 16th century. They unified executive and symbolic authority under one dynasty. But they did so within a conceptual framework shaped by earlier separation. In modern times, his life has been interpreted through additional lenses. 19th-century reformers confronting European expansion looked to earlier periods of unity for inspiration. His coordination of Egypt and Syria became a reference point in discussions of regional solidarity. 20th-century political discourse in the Middle East often invoked his name when addressing questions of leadership and collective identity. Academic study continues to refine understanding of his governance. Researchers examine surviving documents, coins, and architectural remains to reconstruct fiscal policy and administrative structure. Such analysis situates his achievements within broader currents of medieval state formation. Jerusalem, the city most closely associated with his legacy, has experienced repeated changes of control across centuries. Yet the 1187 transition remains significant in historical memory. His decision to negotiate surrender rather than permit massacre influenced how later generations assessed his character. The caliphate world of his lifetime was neither static nor uniformly centralized. It contained multiple centers of authority. Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, linked by shared legal and theological tradition. His career demonstrates how coordination among these centers could be strengthened, without dissolving their distinct roles. He did not seek to restore an early Islamic empire under single caliph. Instead, he reinforced the viability of sultanic rule operating within Kifl framework. That model would influence political thought long after the specific circumstances of the Crusades had faded. The durability of cities within his former domain offers tangible evidence of administrative stability. Cairo continued as major metropolis under successive dynasties. Damascus retained scholarly prominence. Trade routes adapted to shifting global currents but remained active for centuries. In literature, his portrayal evolved from contemporary chronicle to romantic legend. Medieval European writers sometimes depicted him as honorable adversary. Islamic historians emphasize justice and piety. Modern narratives attempt to balance admiration with contextual realism. Across these interpretations, certain constants remain. His disciplined consolidation of fragmented territories, his restoration of sunny alignment in Egypt, his strategic patience in confronting powerful external forces, and his measured approach to governance. His life, when traced from birth in Tree to burial in Damascus, illustrates how leadership within layered institutional world can redirect political trajectory. Opportunity arose from fragmentation. Success depended on coordination. The caliphate world did not become permanently unified, nor did conflict cease. Yet during his lifetime, coherence replaced division sufficiently to alter balance in the eastern Mediterranean. As evening settles over the cities he once governed, the visible structures of that era remain part of their skyline. Beneath those stones lies record of administration and adaptation. His legacy rests not only in captured cities, but in systems that endured beyond individual command. In considering the arc of his career, one finds no sudden transformation, no abrupt break with inherited tradition. Instead, there is gradual alignment of military strength, fiscal discipline, and symbolic legitimacy. That alignment allowed a Kurdish officer's son to become Sultan of Egypt and Syria, to recapture Jerusalem, and to navigate confrontation with European monarchs without dissolving institutional continuity. The caliphate world of the 12th century was defined by fragmentation and possibility. Within that world, Saladin shaped a period of coordinated authority whose effects resonated long after his death. Now, pace of our journey can slow. The campaigns are finished. The letters have been sealed. The courtyards of Damascus grow quiet in the evening air. Imagine the soft murmur of distant water channels in the gardens, the steady rhythm of a city settling into night. The citadel walls stand still against the darkening sky. Markets close their shutters. Lanterns dim. History does not rush. It moves through patient structures and careful hands. The life we have followed tonight unfolded across decades, shaped by discipline more than spectacle. You can let the details settle now. The Nile's flood, the walls of Jerusalem, the corridors of Damascus, each part of a world once divided and then briefly aligned. There is nothing left to resolve. The story has reached its natural rest, so let your thoughts grow quiet. Let the images fade into distance, and as the hum of the evening continues around you, allow yourself to drift,